An elderly black man in glasses confronts 5 threatening young men in hate symbol jackets amid a rose garden at sunset, while the same garden 1 year later shows one of those young men, now in army dress uniform, kneeling beside the elderly man as they plant roses together. Military general watches proudly from a porch in background. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Dr. James Wilson, a 72-year-old retired professor, tended to his prized rose garden. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision among the thorny stems, pruning and shaping with the same care he'd shown for 4 decades. The autumn air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers as he hummed an old gospel hymn, finding peace in this daily ritual. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered his tranquil moment. 5 young men, led by Tyler Reed, swaggered down the street, their matching leather jackets adorned with symbols of hatred and exclusion. They spotted Dr. Wilson, and their faces twisted with malice. Tyler, barely in his 20s but already hardened by prejudice, nudged his companions and pointed toward the elderly man. Dr. Wilson's hands trembled slightly as he set down his pruning shears, but his voice remained steady as he greeted them with dignity. "Good evening, gentlemen. Beautiful day for gardening, isn't it?" His words were met with sneers as the group encircled him. Neighbors peeked through their windows, only to quickly draw their curtains, unwilling to witness what might unfold. The confrontation might have turned ugly, if not for the commanding voice that suddenly rang out across the lawn. "I strongly suggest you step away from my father." The gang turned to find themselves facing General Marcus Wilson, resplendent in his full military dress uniform, stars gleaming on his shoulders. Behind him, 2 military police vehicles idled, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. The autumn air grew thick with tension as Tyler Reed and his gang found themselves frozen in place, their worlds suddenly upended by General Wilson's commanding presence. The setting sun caught the general's stars as he stood there, creating an almost ethereal glow that emphasized his authority. Gone was Tyler's swaggering confidence, replaced by a visible tremor in his hands that he tried desperately to hide by clenching them into fists. Miles Johnston, the youngest of the group at barely 19, felt his throat constrict with recognition. Unlike his companions, Miles came from a military family and understood exactly what those stars on General Wilson's shoulders meant. His father, a career sergeant, had spoken of General Wilson with reverence during dinner conversations. The youngest black general in his division, a tactical genius who had earned every accolade through merit and courage. "Tyler," Miles whispered urgently, his voice cracking with anxiety. "That's General Wilson. He commands the entire Eastern Strategic Command. My dad served under him in—" But Tyler silenced him with a sharp look, though the leader's face had lost several shades of color. Tyler's mind raced, searching for a way to salvage his authority, to maintain some semblance of the power he'd felt just moments ago when threatening an elderly man. The military police officers flanking General Wilson moved with practiced precision, their hands resting casually but purposefully on their belts. The red and blue lights from their vehicles painted the scene in alternating colors, creating an almost surreal atmosphere on the peaceful suburban street. Neighbors who had hidden behind their curtains now peeked out again, witnessing justice arrive in full dress uniform. "I'm General Marcus Wilson," the general announced, his voice carrying the weight of command without needing to raise it. "And you're currently on private property, threatening a decorated veteran who happens to be my father." He took one step forward, and the gang collectively took one step back, their formation breaking down as their bravado crumbled. Dr. Wilson, still standing among his beloved roses, watched the scene unfold with a complex mixture of emotions playing across his weathered features. "Marcus," he said softly, "these young men were just leaving." His words carried no fear now, only a sad understanding of the moment's gravity and its implications for everyone involved. Tyler, desperate to maintain some dignity in retreat, attempted one final show of defiance. "Whatever," he spat out, though his voice trembled slightly. This neighborhood's changed anyway." The words rang hollow, even to his own ears, as they emerged more like a plea than a threat. General Wilson's response was measured but unmistakable in its authority. "Officers," he addressed the military police without taking his eyes off the group, "please escort these gentlemen to their vehicles. We'll need their identification for our records." The hour hung in the air, leaving no doubt that this incident would have repercussions beyond this moment. As the gang was led away, their matching leather jackets now seeming more costume than threat, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The symbols of hatred they wore so proudly moments ago appeared to weigh them down like chains. Miles, last in line, glanced back at Dr. Wilson with an expression that hinted at the first cracks in his indoctrinated worldview. The evening sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across Dr. Wilson's garden. The roses, witnesses to both hatred and justice in the span of minutes, swayed gently in the autumn breeze, their thorns a reminder that beauty and protection often coexist. Father and son stood in the growing dusk, their presence on that lawn a testament to decades of progress and the work still ahead. The Wilson family study stood as a testament to 2 generations of service, one through protest, the other through military might. As evening settled outside, the room's oak-paneled walls glowed warmly under vintage lamplight, casting gentle shadows across decades of carefully preserved memories. Dr. James Wilson and his son, General Marcus Wilson, sat in well-worn leather chairs, their postures a study in contrasts. The father relaxed, yet dignified. The son still ramrod straight in his military bearing even in this intimate setting. Along the walls, history lived in frames. Black and white photographs from the civil rights era showed a younger doctor, Wilson marching alongside giants, arm in arm with fellow protesters in Selma, standing proud at the March on Washington. These images shared space with General Wilson's military accomplishments, his West Point graduation, combat medals, and the ceremony where he received his first General's Star. A particularly striking photo showed father and son together at the integration of their local high school, teenage Marcus standing tall beside his father, who had helped make that moment possible. Dr. Wilson's fingers traced the edge of a yellowed photograph from 1963, his touch gentle as if connecting with old friends through the faded paper. The image showed him among a group of young protesters, their faces alight with determination, despite the visible bruises and bandages that spoke of recent violence. "You didn't have to come all this way, son," he said softly, though his eyes betrayed gratitude beneath his stoic exterior. Marcus leaned forward, his decorated uniform catching the lamplight. "Mrs. Henderson called me," he explained, referring to their longtime neighbor. "Said she'd been seeing that gang around here lately. She was worried, Dad." His voice carried the weight of command, but also a son's concern. The medals on his chest clinked softly as he moved, silver stars and bronze crosses that spoke of battles fought far from home, yet here he was, confronting a different kind of war on his own street. Dr. Wilson's hand lingered on the old photograph. "Reminds me of '63, he mused, his voice distant with memory. "We were about their age, you know. Those boys today, full of anger, thinking hate made them strong." He shook his head slowly, wisdom earned through decades of confronting such hatred evident in his eyes. "Some things change slowly, Marcus, like watching a rose garden grow. You can't force it, can't rush it. Each bloom comes in its own time." The general shifted in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Military efficiency and decisiveness warred with respect for his father's philosophies. "Dad, let me station an MP detail," he proposed, his tone measured but firm. "Just for a while. A visible presence could prevent—" "No." Dr. Wilson's response was gentle but resolute. His eyes met his son's, carrying the same strength that had faced down fire hoses and police dogs decades ago. "Fear and force never changed anyone's heart, son. You of all people should understand that. Your stars were earned by leading men, not just commanding them." The room fell into thoughtful silence, broken only by the distant ticking of an antique clock. A family heirloom that had witnessed 3 generations of Wilsons. Around them, the study's walls seemed to pulse with history. Civil rights medals next to military honors, protest signs alongside battle maps. 2 different but equally valid approaches to fighting for justice. A framed article on the desk caught the lamplight, highlighting a headline about Dr. Wilson's groundbreaking work integrating local schools in the 1970s. Beside it sat General Wilson's recent military commendation for his leadership in humanitarian missions. Father and son, 2 men who had chosen different paths toward the same goal, making the world a better place for the next generation. Dr. Wilson stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked his beloved rose garden. In the gathering dusk, the flowers were mere shadows, but he knew each one by heart. "Those boys today," he said thoughtfully, "they're like unturned soil, hard on the surface, but with the right touch, the right patience." He turned back to his son, a gentle smile touching his lips. "Sometimes the strongest deterrent isn't a show of force, but a demonstration of unwavering dignity." General Wilson watched his father, seeing in that moment both the young firebrand from the photographs and the wise elder who had never lost his faith in humanity's capacity for change. The contrast between their methods, his father's patient cultivation of hearts and minds versus his own more direct approach to confronting evil, seemed suddenly less stark. Perhaps they were just different tools for tilling the same soil. The study held them in its embrace, father and son, soldier and scholar, each carrying forward the fight for justice in their own way. Outside, the roses continued their slow, steady growth, much like the progress of the human heart, toward understanding and acceptance. Morning light streamed through the high windows of General Marcus Wilson's office at Fort Hamilton, casting long rectangles of sunlight across his polished wooden desk. The office itself spoke of military precision, medals and commendations arranged with exactitude, maps precisely aligned on walls, and folders stacked with meticulous care. Yet today, this ordered world was about to be shaken by unexpected connections. General Wilson sat behind his desk, his uniform immaculate as always, though the lines around his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. Before him lay several manila folders, their contents spread out like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. Crime scene photos, incident reports, and witness statements painted a picture that grew darker with each page turned. His coffee, usually finished by this hour, sat cold and untouched at his elbow. A sharp knock interrupted his concentration. "Enter," he commanded, his voice carrying the automatic authority of decades of military service. Sergeant Maria Ramirez stepped inside, her posture perfect, but her expression suggested she carried news that would complicate an already complex situation. "Sir," she began, holding out a fresh set of documents, "we've completed the background checks on the gang members from yesterday's incident." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Wilson to notice, short enough to maintain military protocol. "There's something you need to see regarding Tyler Reed." Wilson accepted the folder, his expression unchanging as he opened it. But as his eyes scanned the first page, something shifted in his bearing. "Tyler Reed," he read aloud, his voice carefully controlled, "son of Colonel James Reed, currently stationed at Fort Benning." He looked up at Sergeant Ramirez. "James Reed. My God." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Colonel James Reed wasn't just another officer. He was a decorated combat veteran who had served alongside Wilson in Operation Desert Storm. They'd saved each other's lives more than once, shared countless meals, watched each other's children grow up through photographs exchanged during deployments. And now, James's son was leading a gang of racist thugs. "Get me James on the phone," Wilson ordered. But Ramirez wasn't finished. "Sir, there's more." She pulled out another document, this one marked with red flags. "We've linked Reed's group to 3 other incidents in the area over the past 2 months. Nothing that escalated to the level of yesterday's confrontation, but the pattern is clear." She laid out 3 incident reports, each accompanied by surveillance photos showing Tyler's gang intimidating elderly black residents. Wilson studied the photos, his jaw tightening. The first showed the gang vandalized a black-owned business, its windows shattered. The second documented harassment of an elderly couple leaving church. The third, this one made his blood run cold, revealed them following a group of black children home from school. Each incident had grown progressively bolder, more threatening. "The local police?" he inquired, though he suspected the answer. "Aware but inactive, sir," Ramirez confirmed. "The victims were reluctant to press charges. Most just wanted to avoid further trouble." Wilson stood and walked to his office window, looking out over the base. Below, soldiers of every race and background trained together, their uniforms making them indistinguishable from this height. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he commanded one of the most successfully integrated institutions in American history, while just outside the base's gates, the old hatred still festered. "Sir?" Ramirez ventured after a moment of silence. "How do you want to proceed?" Given Colonel Reed's position, Wilson turned back to his desk and picked up his phone. "First, I'm calling James. He needs to hear this from me, not through official channels." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Then we're going to handle this situation in a way that stops it permanently, not just drives it underground." As he dialed, his eyes fell on a framed photograph on his desk, himself as a young lieutenant, standing proudly beside Colonel Reed after their first combat mission together. Next to it sat yesterday's incident report, with Tyler Reed's sneering mugshot paperclipped to the corner. Father and son, 2 generations, 2 radically different paths. "Get me everything you can on the other gang members," he instructed Ramirez. "Family backgrounds, employment, known associates. If we're going to solve this, we need to understand how these young men were led down this path." He glanced at his father's civil rights photos on the wall. "And Sergeant, contact the Community Relations Office. I think it's time we got creative about how we handled this situation." The phone began to ring as Ramirez saluted and left. Wilson steeled himself for one of the hardest conversations of his career. Before him lay an opportunity not just to stop a series of hate crimes, but to address the root causes that allowed such hatred to flourish. As his father had taught him, sometimes the hardest battles were fought not with weapons, but with wisdom, patience, and understanding. "James," he said as the line connected. "It's Marcus. We need to talk about Tyler." Colonel James Reed's office at Fort Benning felt smaller than usual that afternoon, the walls seeming to close in as he sat across from his old friend and superior officer, General Marcus Wilson. The space between them, normally comfortable with years of shared battlefield experience, now crackled with unspoken tension. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows that looked almost like prison bars across Colonel Reed's desk. Reed's face, usually composed with military discipline, showed the ravages of a sleepless night. The lines around his eyes had deepened since receiving Wilson's call, and his normally pristine uniform bore subtle signs of distraction. A slightly askew tie, a ribbon rack not quite level. Before him lay a folder containing printed photographs of his son Tyler's activities, each image a hammer blow to his pride as both a soldier and a father. "I had no idea, Marcus." Reed finally broke the heavy silence, his voice hardly above a whisper. His fingers traced the edge of one particularly damning photograph. Tyler, face contorted with hatred, confronting Dr. Wilson in his garden. "Tyler's been difficult since his mother passed." The words hung in the air, an explanation that felt hollow even as he spoke them. General Wilson leaned forward slightly, his stars catching the sunlight. "James, your son assaulted a veteran." "My father." His tone was measured, carefully balancing their personal history with the gravity of the situation. "But this isn't just about yesterday. There's a pattern here that's been escalating for months." Reed pushed back from his desk abruptly, standing to pace behind his chair. Family photos lined his office walls, Tyler's high school graduation, sports tournaments, happier times. But most prominent was a large portrait of Sarah, his late wife, her smile forever frozen in time. Sarah would be... He stopped, unable to complete the thought. After we lost her, Tyler just changed. Started hanging with a different crowd. I was deployed when she got sick, Marcus. Maybe if I'd been here. We all carry those maybes, James, Wilson responded, his voice softening slightly. But right now, we need to focus on what is, not what might have been. Reed's military bearing suddenly reasserted itself, his spine straightening as he turned to face Wilson. I'll handle this. The military way. His voice carried the hard edge of command, the tone he used with subordinates who had stepped out of line. I can get him into the service. Give him some discipline. Structure, no. Wilson's interruption was gentle, but firm. We'll handle this the right way. He stood, moving to stand beside his old friend, their reflections side by side in the office window. James, we've both seen what happens when we try to bury problems under uniform and protocol. They don't go away. They fester. Outside the window, afternoon drill was underway, dozens of soldiers moving in perfect unison across the parade ground. Black, white, brown, all wearing the same uniform, all part of the same team. The sight seemed to deflate Reed, his shoulders sagging slightly. What do you suggest? He asked, suddenly sounding very tired. Wilson turned to face his friend directly. Your son needs to understand the weight of his actions, not through punishment, but through education, through connection with the very people he's learned to hate. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. My father has offered to help. Reed's head snapped up, disbelief evident in his expression. Your father? After what Tyler did? He's been fighting this battle a lot longer than either of us, James. He understands something we're both still learning, that hate is taught, and it can be untaught. Wilson moved back to his chair, sitting down deliberately. But it's going to take both of us. Military discipline isn't enough. Tyler needs his father, not his colonel. The office fell silent, except for the distant cadence calls from the parade ground. Reed slowly sank back into his chair, his eyes fixed on Sarah's portrait. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of both command and fatherly concern. Tell me what you need me to do. Wilson reached into his briefcase and pulled out a detailed proposal. A community intervention program combining veteran mentorship with civil rights education. We start by showing Tyler a different path, one his mother would have been proud of. The mention of Sarah seemed to settle something in Reed's expression. He reached for the proposal, and as he did, a shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through the blinds, illuminating both men, two military leaders, two fathers, united in the mission to save not just Tyler, but perhaps something larger than any one person. For Sarah, Reed said quietly, taking the folder. For all of them, Wilson replied, gesturing toward the parade ground where the next generation of soldiers continued their drill. Their synchronized movements a testament to what was possible when people moved past their differences and worked together. The community center's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow across the worn linoleum floor. The space, usually filled with after-school programs and senior citizen activities, had been transformed into something more solemn. Metal folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle, each one occupied by people who, under normal circumstances, would never choose to be in the same room together. Dr. James Wilson stood at the front, his 72 years carrying the weight of history. He wore a simple brown tweed jacket with leather patches at the elbows, the same one he'd worn while teaching history at the local university for 3 decades. Behind him, a projector screen showed black and white photographs from the civil rights era, frozen moments of struggle and triumph. Tyler Reed sat in the front row, his gang members spread out beside him, their matching leather jackets now seeming out of place in this setting. They'd been stripped of their usual swagger, looking more like lost boys than the intimidating force they'd tried to be. Colonel Reed sat directly behind his son, close enough to touch him, but maintaining a deliberate distance that spoke volumes about their strained relationship. "I was 19, Dr. Wilson began, his voice carrying the same quiet strength it had shown in his garden, "when I watched my best friend die on a bridge in Selma." He clicked to the next slide. A young man with a brilliant smile, frozen in time. His name was Marcus Thompson. I named my son after him. The room grew still. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old building seemed to fade away. "Marcus didn't die from the clubs or the dogs," Dr. Wilson continued, his eyes finding Tyler's. "He died because someone decided his humanity was less valuable than their hatred." He let that sink in before adding, "Just like someone decided my roses were more offensive than their beauty." Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between the floor and the photographs. The young man's facade of indifference was cracking, revealing glimpses of the confused, hurting child beneath. "When I was your age," Dr. Wilson addressed the group, moving closer, "I watched my friends die for the right to walk these streets. But I never lost faith in humanity's capacity to grow." He paused beside Miles, the youngest gang member who couldn't meet his gaze. "Do you know why?" The silence stretched, until Tyler, perhaps surprising even himself, spoke up. "Why are you even talking to us?" His voice was quiet, lacking its usual venom. "After what we did?" Dr. Wilson smiled gently, the kind of smile that had guided generations of students toward understanding. "Because hatred is taught," he said, "and it can be untaught." He clicked to another photograph, this one showing a group of former segregationists and civil rights activists sharing a meal together. This was taken 10 years after the riots. People who once threw rocks at each other, breaking bread together. Colonel Reed leaned forward slightly, his hand hovering near his son's shoulder but not quite making contact. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Dr. Wilson. "Your father served with my son," Dr. Wilson addressed Tyler directly. "They saved each other's lives more than once. Not because of the color of their skin, but because of the content of their character." He clicked to a photo of young General Wilson and Colonel Reed in combat gear, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning through desert dust. Tyler's head snapped up, his eyes fixing on the image of his father, younger, happier, standing shoulder to shoulder with a black man. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face. "But that's different," Tyler protested weakly. "That's the military." "That's humanity," Dr. Wilson corrected gently. "When we choose to see it." He moved back to the front of the room, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "The same humanity that exists in each of you, if you're brave enough to embrace it." The air conditioning kicked in with a rattle, making several people jump. Dr. Wilson used the moment to switch to a new photograph, this one showing his rose garden in full bloom. "Those roses you were so offended by? They were planted by my wife and Sarah Reed, Tyler's mother, the summer before Sarah got sick." He let that information land, watching as both Tyler and Colonel Reed straightened in their chairs. They spent every Saturday together in that garden, planning, planting, sharing dreams about their children's futures. Tyler's tough exterior crumbled visibly at the mention of his mother. A tear tracked down his cheek, quickly wiped away, but not before others had seen it. Colonel Reed finally breached the distance, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "So, when you ask why I'm talking to you," Dr. Wilson concluded, his voice gentle but firm, "it's because Sarah believed in beauty, in growth, in the possibility of something better." He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "And I refuse to let hatred destroy what hope planted." The silence that followed was different from the one that had started the session. It was a silence full of possibility, of long-buried truths beginning to surface, of walls starting to crumble. "What? ... Tyler's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What kind of roses did they plant?" Dr. Wilson's smile reached his eyes. "Peace roses," he said. "Your mother's favorite." Over the months that followed, change came not in dramatic moments, but in small, steady steps, like the gradual blooming of Dr. Wilson's roses. The Veterans Center became their first battleground for change. Tyler and his former gang members found themselves surrounded by veterans of every race and background, each with stories that challenged their preconceptions. An elderly black veteran, walking with a cane from wounds received saving his entire platoon in Vietnam, shared war stories that left Tyler speechless. A Hispanic former sergeant helped Miles repair his motorcycle, teaching him about engines while casually mentioning his 3 tours in Afghanistan. The most powerful moment came when they discovered photographs of Tyler's mother, Sarah, volunteering at the center years ago. She had organized care packages for deployed troops, never distinguishing between the colors of the hands that would receive them. Tyler stood before her photo for a long time, his father's hand on his shoulder, both men silent but speaking volumes. Dr. Wilson's history lessons evolved beyond mere lectures. He took them to historical sites, let them touch artifacts from the civil rights era, made the past tangible and real. The young men learned about the economic costs of hatred, the human toll of prejudice, and the strength required for forgiveness. "Tell me about the sheriff," Miles asked one day, pointing to a photograph of a white law enforcement officer helping protesters up after a clash with segregationists. "Ah," Dr. Wilson smiled. "That's the story of how your grandfather changed, Tyler." Tyler's head snapped up. His own grandfather had been a sheriff during the civil rights era, a fact his family never discussed. As Dr. Wilson shared the story of a man who chose courage over conformity, Tyler saw his own journey reflected in his family's hidden history. The transformation manifested physically as well. One by one, the leather jackets with their symbols of hatred disappeared. The first to go was Miles's, traded for a volunteer vest at the community center. Others followed, each jacket removed like a snake shedding old skin. They replaced them with T-shirts bearing the logos of veteran organizations, community groups, and local charities. The Rose Garden became an unexpected sanctuary. Miles showed a natural talent for horticulture, spending hours learning from Dr. Wilson about pruning, fertilizing, and nurturing new growth. Other gang members joined sporadically, finding peace in the simple act of creating beauty rather than destroying it. Colonel Reed and Tyler attended counseling together, their sessions often running long as they unpacked years of unspoken grief over Sarah's death. The military psychologist helped them understand how pain could transform into hatred, and how hatred could be transformed back into love. "Your mother," Colonel Reed said during one session, his voice thick with emotion, "she used to say that hate was just love that had lost its way home." The community watched this metamorphosis with cautious optimism. Former victims became cautious allies as the young men proved their change through consistent action, rather than mere words. The gang's old gathering spots, once sites of intimidation, became locations for community service projects. The most visible symbol of change came during a Veterans Appreciation event. Tyler, standing before a mixed crowd, shared his story of transformation. Behind him hung a new mural painted by former gang members, a field of roses in full bloom, with the words, "Growth requires courage," written in flowing script. "We thought we were protecting something," Tyler told the crowd, his father and Dr. Wilson seated in the front row. "But all we were doing was building walls around our own hearts." That evening, as the sun set over the community center, Dr. Wilson watched Tyler help an elderly black veteran up the stairs, supporting him with the same hands that had once threatened violence. The old man patted Tyler's shoulder in thanks, and Tyler's smile, genuine, unguarded, was the finest bloom in Dr. Wilson's garden of second chances. A year to the day after the confrontation, Tyler Reed stood in Dr. Wilson's rose garden wearing his crisp new Army uniform. The morning sun caught the polished buttons of his dress greens, and the roses bloomed around him in vibrant clusters, living testimonies to the power of nurture over nature. "I ship out tomorrow, Dr. Wilson," Tyler said, his voice steady but humble. "Basic training at Fort Benning." His hands, once clenched in hatred, now gently touched a peace rose bloom. Same place where my father started. Dr. Wilson surveyed his garden, now more vibrant than ever thanks to the care it had received from unexpected hands over the past year. Your father must be proud. He is, Tyler nodded, then hesitated before adding, I wanted to say, I'm sorry, and thank you for showing me a better way. His voice cracked slightly. Mom would have loved these roses, she did, Dr. Wilson smiled, reaching for his gardening tools. Come, help me plant something before you go. Together, they dug into the rich earth, their hands working in harmony to create space for new life. As they planted a fresh peace rose bush, Dr. Wilson shared one final piece of wisdom. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. From the porch, General Wilson watched the scene unfold. His father and Tyler worked together, their shadows merging in the morning light as they patted soil around the new plant. The garden had become more than just a collection of flowers. It was a living monument to transformation. The new rose bush would bloom the following spring, adding its beauty to a garden that had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. Like the young man in uniform kneeling beside it, it represented the possibility of growth, of change, of beauty, emerging from the soil of understanding.